Resuming debate, the honourable member for Lakeland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's great to be back in the House of Commons on behalf of the people of Lakeland and Canadians everywhere who want life to be more affordable and also want energy and food security, which is the most important economic and geopolitical question facing the free world. Bill C-49, unfortunately, is another step in a long line of Liberal laws and policies since 2015 that appears destined to drive investment out of Canada with more uncertainty, red tape, and extended and costly timelines. Hopefully this time, the Liberals will actually listen to cautions and analysis during debate and committee consideration to prevent the rather ridiculous current spectacle they're now caught in, claiming to want to reduce permitting and regulatory timelines, even though they've been in the government for 8 years, and they're actually talking about the extra red tape, confusion, and potentially endless timelines that they themselves imposed through C-69, which Conservatives and then municipalities, Indigenous leaders, private sector proponents, and all provinces and territories did warn about at the time. But you know what? As always, the Liberals figured they knew best, and they sure did create a heck of a broken mess. Ostensibly, this bill amends the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board and the Canada, Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board to become the regulators and adds offshore renewables to their mandates while creating a regulatory regime for offshore and wind and other renewable energy projects that currently exist for offshore petroleum operations. Now, it's a reasonable and a necessary initiative, to be sure, and Conservatives are glad to see the inclusion of the provincial governments as required partners in final decisions on this joint jurisdiction. I might note that's a principle the Liberals often abandon when it comes to other provincial governments with whom they disagree. But it's both unfortunately and unsurprisingly clear that Bill C-49 will also subject offshore renewable energy to the same web of uncertain regulations, long, costly timelines, and political decision-making that has driven hundreds of billions of dollars in private sector energy investment, hundreds of businesses, and hundreds of thousands of energy jobs out of Canada and into other jurisdictions around the world. Bill C-49 also includes provisions that could impose a full shutdown and ban on offshore oil and gas development at any time. That's a direct attack on one of Newfoundland's key industries, risks undermining the rights of Indigenous communities and local communities to meaningful consultation, and ignores the work and aspirations of other locally impacted communities and residents. Now, of course, the Liberals have already threatened offshore activity in Newfoundland and Labrador, with a minister saying that the decision on Bay du Nord was the most difficult one they had ever made. Bay du Nord, of course, would have provided more than 13,000 jobs overall, 97.6 billion in national GDP, 82 billion in provincial GDP, more than 8,900 jobs, 11 billion in taxes, and 12.8 billion in royalty revenues for Newfoundland and Labrador, 7.2 billion in GDP and more than 2,200 jobs for Ontario, 2.6 billion and more than 900 jobs for Quebec, 3.1 billion in GDP and almost 700 jobs for Albertans. But like usual is the pattern under this government, the private sector proponent has put that project on hold for 3 years because of uncertainty. As written, this bill has many gaps. The Liberals must clarify sooner than later a number of practical implications. For example, will the offshore boards need more resources for technical expertise or personnel, or more funding to fulfill the additional responsibilities? If so, who will pay for it? And what is a realistic expectation of when the regulators would be fully ready for the work outside of their current scope? What about the responsibility for health and safety regulations for renewable energy projects at sea, which are currently the job of the respective offshore boards on offshore rigs and under the Department of Labour on land? These obligations should be clearly defined jurisdictionally in this bill. What about environmental considerations relating to offshore renewable projects? The boards, the truth is, currently have no experience in activities around wind, tidal, and other sea-based energies that may disrupt ecosystems and seaweed growth, harm seabirds, whales, fish stock, lobster stock, or interfere with organisms that live on the seabed like anemones and corals and crabs and sea urchins and spongids. What provisions are needed for the regulators to adequately assess risks to key habitat and vulnerable species? Now, I can't imagine, nor would I ever suggest that the NDP-Liberals will add upstream emissions requirements as a condition for such approvals, like it did, along with downstream emissions in a double standard deliberately designed to kill the west to east pipeline that could have created energy self-security and self-sufficiency for Canada by refining and exporting Western resources on Atlantic Canadian coasts for export. European allies and Ukrainians sure would definitely appreciate that now, wouldn't they? But it would certainly be a significant hurdle if they did, given what's really involved in the manufacturing of steel and concrete for offshore renewable projects, which do create a lot of hazardous waste on the back end, for example. Now, if the Liberals actually care about cumulative impacts like they always say they do, they would clarify all of that in this bill too. The Liberals must account for these considerations. And at this point, after 8 years, Canadians should be skeptical if this government says it will just work out the details later or in regulations after the fact. That's always become a disaster under these guys, no matter the issue. On top of these unanswered questions, the reality is this bill triples the timeline for a final decision on alternative energy projects and gives political decision makers the ability to extend that timeline potentially indefinitely. If this all sounds familiar, a lack of details on crucial issues, uncertainty around roles, responsibilities, and requirements, timelines that actually have so many loopholes for interference that no concrete timelines really exist at all, that's because it is. This is what the Liberals did in Bill C-69, which Conservatives warned would help prevent any major pipeline projects from being approved or even proposed in Canada since it was passed in 2019, and has become a gatekeeping roadblock to private sector proponents in all areas of resource development and the pursuit of major projects in Canada. The reality is companies won't invest billions in building energy infrastructure in Canada's uncertain fiscal and regulatory framework where excessive and duplicative red tape mean there's no consistency or certainty in the assessment process, no clear rules or a path to completion, and no guaranteed return on investment, which can all be lost at the whim of a government minister's decision. Unilateral decision. And as much as the Liberals wish it were true, alternative energy projects are not in a separate magical category from oil and gas where they are somehow immune from these basic economic and fiscal considerations, well, except for all those publicly funded through subsidies or paid for by utility ratepayers, definitely a significant proportion of renewable and alternative energy to date, especially outside of Alberta. The fiscal and, where it's done by the private sector primarily, the fiscal and regulatory sector proponents politely call the lack of a business, the fiscal, here's what the Liberals and the NDP have to really get straight here. The fiscal and regulatory framework is a crucial and definitive aspect of what private sector proponents politely call the lack of a business case every time they halt or abandon a major project after years and years and millions of dollars of working towards it, usually to move their focus and, tragically, their money, their jobs, their innovation, initiative, creativity, and expertise to other countries. And the Liberals have already created these same adverse conditions for wind, solar, and tidal too. Just take the Peppercue tidal energy project in the Bay of Fundy. It would have provided clean green energy to Nova Scotia's electrical grid, and it could have generated up to 2,500 megawatts while bringing in $100 million in investment and significantly reducing emissions. But after repeated delays, a tide of Liberal red tape and, quote, 5 years of insurmountable regulatory challenges, the proponent withdrew, and it folded. Sustainable Marine wasn't the only victim of multiple layers of red tape and involved departments, though. Other renewable projects, like a pulp mill that would have created biodegradable plastics from their waste stream, left Canada because the Liberals told the proponents that the approval phase under their gatekeepers would take 20 years. Wow. The bottom line is that energy companies, like any company, need certainty to invest, whether in the oil sands, natural gas, critical minerals, pipelines, hydrogen and petrochemicals, wind or solar farms, or hydroelectricity. Proponents need concrete timelines, consistent, well-defined, and predictable regulatory measures, and to be confident that a government will respect jurisdictional responsibilities and be willing to enforce the rule of law and take action, if necessary, for projects after approval, so proponents proponents can know that if they follow the rules, meet the conditions, and act in good faith, they will be successful. Companies and the regulators also need to account for possible risks posed to local activities, most notably the impacts of offshore wind development and other technologies on the livelihoods of Atlantic fishers and lobstermen. In this case, all impacted parties need to be involved in the consultation process from the get-go. Unfortunately, the Liberals' Bill C-49 creates the opposite for both alternative energy sources as well as offshore oil and gas. When it comes to crafting anti-energy legislation, you know, these Liberals, with their NDP power-broking coalition, just can't seem to help themselves. Sections 28 and 137 in this bill give the government the power, as I mentioned before, to completely end any current offshore drilling for oil and gas, as well as any offshore alternative energy development. Obviously, that's an immediate threat to the sector because of that uncertainty even for existing operations, and it risks any future projects in these provinces by designating prohibited development areas. Notably, the bill states that any activity may be suspended in those areas. That obviously includes offshore petroleum drilling and exploration, but the language could also include offshore wind and other alternative energy development. So one thing that is predictable is that that's a pattern, because it's similar to a previous Liberal Bill C-55, which allows a government minister to unilaterally designate any marine area in Canada as a prohibited development zone. So the Liberals must answer, will their increasing targets in the language in Bill C-49 cancel and or prohibit both traditional and renewable energy projects if located in those areas? What are the restrictions? How can developers make investment decisions if the areas where they operate may suddenly be declared prohibited? The Liberals are so comfortable with their nearly decade-long pattern of piling on layers of anti-energy, anti-development, anti-private sector laws, policies, and taxes on Canada's key sectors. They hinder both traditional sources of energy that they recklessly want to phase out prematurely and stand in the way of renewable and new technologies that they purport to want to. This discussion cannot be removed from the context that Canada is still operating, or rather more accurately, not operating, under the rules and red tape of this NDP Liberal government imported into this bill. Bill C-69, of course, actually completely erased the concept of having any actual timelines for approving energy infrastructure, and instead allows for limitless and indefinite extensions of regulatory timelines, as we warned. Unfortunately, it just creates a swath of potential maybes on project applications because of the potential for suspensions, delays, and uncertainty about measures for applications and outcomes. With Bill C-69, as many Canadians said at the time, the Liberals might as well have hung a sign in the window that says Canada is closed for business. Because what is clear and should be stunningly and frankly through a total travesty be clear to all Canadians by now is that clear timelines and requirements and predictable rules and responsibilities provide certainty for private sector proponents that benefit the whole country. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canada ranks 31st among peers in the burden of regulations as of 2018 and is less than half as competitive as the OECD average in administrative burdens on energy project startups. Canada is second last in the OECD for construction permits, only ahead of Slovakia, and 64th in the world for building permits. The Liberals touted creating certainty and predictability for energy companies with clear rules and regulations to follow, but the actual bill created a massive new web of poorly defined criteria for companies and gave cabinet ministers the power to add any criteria to the list that they want at any time. There's no predictability or consistency, and Bill C-49 is an extension of that pattern. Another concerning part is the provisions that specify the regulators in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia as the parties responsible for Indigenous consultation for offshore oil and gas and affordable energy projects. I must say that Conservatives believe in greater authority and autonomy for provinces to govern their own affairs. We want less Ottawa. Conservatives believe in smaller governments and a shift of power to individuals and local communities. And you know what? The many Indigenous communities where I'm from from and all across the country who are reliant on and depend on traditional and alternative energy development, they all say the same thing. But I want to caution the NDP Liberals that this section may invite court challenges if it isn't clarified, which would create even more costly delays in an already drawn out and unpredictable process. Through years of extensive legal challenges, precedent, and judicial decisions on major energy infrastructure, courts have emphasized that it's the Crown's duty to consult Indigenous people, and that a failure on the part of the government to ensure a two-way dialogue and that actual decision makers are at the table during the consultation process is what has overturned approval decisions. That was the case when the Liberals' approval of the Trans Mountain expansion under their own process and Indigenous consultation was overturned, and the minister had to spend months meeting with Indigenous communities to redo it, which of course they also could have done with the Northern Gateway pipeline before that and would have saved everyone the time and money later on with TMX. But instead, the Prime Minister vetoed Northern Gateway, which blocked exports from the West Coast to countries in Asia who need our energy desperately, and killed all the equity and mutual benefit agreements for the 31 Indigenous communities along the pipeline that supported it. But I digress. As currently drafted, this bill explicitly delegates the regulators as responsible for Indigenous consultation, is silent on the Crown's particular duty to consult, and also shifts the power of final decision-making to federal and provincial government ministers. So on top of the fact that Indigenous leaders often consider a federal minister specifically as the appropriate decision-maker to engage with them, if the current or future governments rely too much or exclusively on the regulators for all assessments not captured by the Impact Assessment Act's consultation process, as is suggested in this bill, this section risks court challenges to proposed and approved projects in the long run and will jeopardize both future offshore renewable and petroleum projects. The impact of the uncertainty created by this Liberal government cannot be overstated. It takes Canada out of the global competition for energy development, punishing the best in class, and cedes market share to dictators and regimes with far lower environmental and human rights standards. It cost Canada billions of dollars in investment and hundreds of thousands of jobs, and robbed Canadians and Canada's free and democratic allies of many irreplaceable opportunities, energy security, and hope for the future. But I believe the impact on provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia deserves special attention. Anyone who's worked in Alberta's oil patch has no doubt worked together with many Newfoundlanders and Nova Scotians. Certainly that's where my own family came from. My mother was from Newfoundland, my father was from Nova Scotia, my grandmother was the first female mayor of Dartmouth, and I'm a first-generation Albertan. As my own constituents have been hit hard by the hostile, divisive NDP Liberal government, and other than the people of Saskatchewan, our neighbours and often interchangeable citizens based on the free enterprise policies of our respective provincial governments at any given time, the people most concerned about the damage done to Alberta are consistently Atlantic Canadians. I wish that more of my neighbours could hear directly from Atlantic Canadians who are always effusive in their reverence for Alberta and our main industries. Atlantic Canadians share with Albertans feeling of distance and neglect from Ottawa, and they are concerned about the exact same consequences of NDP Liberal policies, the skyrocketing cost of living and fuel and food prices, being forced to choose between heating and eating, reliance on energy sources for which there are few affordable or immediate options, worry about how to make ends meet, and wanting hope for the future. Thousands of people from Atlantic Canada every year come to Alberta to support their families and communities through the array of diverse opportunities offered by Alberta's globally renowned energy and renewable energy sectors, with steady work in high-paying, quality jobs that contribute revenue to all three levels of government for public services and programs that Canadians rely on. That impact was unprecedented. In 2014, for example, 9 out of every 10 full-time jobs created in Canada were created in Alberta, and every job in the oil sands creates 2 direct and 3 induced jobs at home in other regions and provinces. But while Albertans and Atlantic Canadian, but while public enemy number one for the NDP-Liberal anti-energy and anti-private sector policies during the last 8 years is Alberta, the truth is the costly coalition's approach hurts the whole country, especially Atlantic Canadians. Because while Albertans and Atlantic Canadians are inextricably linked and have helped to build each other's provinces, there's always a human cost to having to move away for work. Generations of parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents spent 100 years working hard to build lives, businesses, farms, and futures for their kids. But now their children and grandchildren are being forced to seek out opportunities elsewhere. Legacies left behind, that's the very real generational impact of anti-development, anti-resource policies. And Conservatives, in conclusion, Madam Speaker, we want to see the same opportunities, the same high-paying quality jobs for people in Newfoundland and Labrador and Nova Scotia as in Alberta and for every Canadian. Conservatives want families to be able to stay together, for parents to be able to see their kids, for cousins to know each other, and to build upon legacies secured by generations before them.
That's questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Minister, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for her speech, and thank you for her work that she's done on natural resources over the years, and looking forward to working with her more closely in the coming years. The member talked about at great length about other bills and other issues not related to C-49. This bill is looking at creating jobs, looking at attracting investment, and that's been the federal government's approach. I want to ask the member, can she explain why both provincial premiers, Premier Fury and Premier Houston, are supporting this bill? Can the member explain if the Conservative Party will be supporting this bill, support the premiers, support investment, and support jobs with C-49? Thank you.
Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Well, thank you to the member for his question. I sure did enjoy our time together on the Natural Resources Committee in my first term. So the issue is that actually I spent a whole lot of time talking about C-49, and aspects of this bill, C-49, are imported from bills like C-69 and C-55, which is why I talked about them, to give context for policymakers, for elected representatives in this debate, and for all Canadians. I suspect the provinces of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador are supportive of the intent of this bill, because they also want to have effective, efficient regulatory frameworks for both petroleum and alternative energy offshore development. And a crucial thing that we support is that in this bill is that this does include the requirements of provincial ministers to be consulted in the case of any of the decision-making around development areas and the regulations and the framework for this development offshore. Obviously, those provincial governments should be partners. I suspect that's why they support it. Of course, that does stand in contrast to provincial governments that the Liberals attack on energy when they disagree with them.
Questions et commentaires.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Mesquinongé. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my Honourable Member for her question. My question is rather simple. We seem to be before a bill that is in the Liberal wave of trying to put forward renewable energies, but at the end of the day, nothing is going to change. And they're still going to help oil and gas. The Bloc Québécois believes that oil and gas has to be gradually reduced or slowed down. Does the Honourable Member believe that we should begin to act now to slow down the effects of climate change? That's my first question. My second question, is she ready to consider in the study of this bill that we start to seriously talk about a progressive and reasonable and intelligent slowdown of the oil and gas sector whilst helping those in the oil and gas sector so that it can one day be replaced by renewable energies?
Lakeland.
Well, this is, I guess, the key philosophical dividing point between Conservatives and every other party in the House of Commons, which Canadians should know. Conservatives recognize the reality that multi-pronged energy companies, multi-pronged private sector energy companies are involved in the development of innovation and technology across the entire expanse of different kinds of oil and gas production, as well as all kinds of different sources of energy production. Certainly in Alberta's case, that stands as an example with the oldest and largest scale commercialized solar and wind farm. That's been been going on for decades, so funded mainly by oil sands and pipeline companies. So here's where conservatives stand. Global demand for oil and gas will continue to rise for the foreseeable future. Conservatives believe that Canada should be the supplier of choice for our responsible oil and gas products and technologies which will help lower global emissions and are produced under the highest standards of in the world. And it's...
You have to allow for other questions, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a great respect for my colleague, and I love being on committee with her, and we have lots of great discussions. I'm really fascinated by her concern about driving investment out of Canada. Exhibit 1, Danielle Smith. There is no place on the planet that has more opportunity for clean energy than Alberta, but you have a premier who believes that the world is, 5,000 years old and that the dinosaurs existed at the same time Fred Flintstone, and shut down huge opportunities in clean energy. Alberta lost 91 projects, $33 billion at a time when the Biden administration is moving ahead $110 billion in opportunities. So we have huge opportunity in Alberta shut down, driven out of the country by the bizarre talk of Daniel Smith. So I want to ask my honourable colleague, is her leader willing to tie himself to Danielle Smith, stagecoach to nowhere, or will they be willing to compete for clean energy in Alberta?
For Lakeland.
Well, I too enjoy working with this colleague of the Natural Resources Committee, and having got to know him over the past couple of years, I also enjoy his CDs, even though we give each other the gears on a very regular basis because of our divergent worldviews. I'm quite frankly confused why the member actually doesn't see the wisdom in a world-renowned energy and renewable energy development jurisdiction, starting on the front end to implement clear requirements, clear conditions, clear accountability to Albertans, through the entire process, as well as remediation, reclamation, which will help set attractive investment conditions for alternative energy development and build confidence among Albertans in the long term for the development of those projects. That's an important, responsible tactic that a provincial government must take, and shouldn't be surprising, I guess, also since the province has always led in regulatory standards for all kinds of energy development.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Standish Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My honourable colleague from Lakeland would probably be the only one in the House who's not surprised by what I'm going to say, which is that Bill C-69 was not in the interests of environmental assessment in Canada, was so poorly designed. It's all discretionary. There's no timelines. And the only thing that made environmentalists think it was a good bill was that Jason Kenney called it the Anti-Pipeline Act. It could just as easily have been called the Pro-Pipeline Act because it's discretionary and lacks the basics that had been in our environmental assessment law since the mid-1970s through the early 90s, when former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney brought forward a very good Environmental Assessment Act. So my honourable colleague from Lakeland, she knows that we will disagree on the notion that we want to expand oil and gas demand across the world, and that there's any such thing as responsible oil and gas. There's only fossil fuels, and burning them destroys our future. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Lakeland.
Well, yes, I do recall finding interesting points of agreement on C-69 around the arbitrary, unilateral, and unclear impacts of that bill, but as she noted, with wildly divergent worldviews and aspirations for the energy sector in Canada. Since we're debating this federally, let me just emphasize what Conservatives believe in. We believe in lower taxes and red tape and the elimination of duplicative and onerous regulations so businesses can thrive. Conservatives want Canada to be the supplier of choice for our responsible oil and gas development, our own energy affordability, security, and for our allies. As Prime Minister, our Conservative leader would greenlight green technology so brilliant engineers can advance more affordable electricity. We would reduce approval timelines for all energy projects, remove unnecessary and duplicative red tape, and punishing taxes so entrepreneurs and companies can invest in Canada, and so major energy and infrastructure projects can actually get built in this country, unlike the NDP-Liberals, who gatekeep, roadblock, and make traditional energy more expensive while delaying and driving out new energy opportunities.